Welcome, everybody. I'm Selena Rezvani, and you're joining Women and Work Culture. This is a live stream all about helping women rise at work. And today we're talking about building more respectful, inclusive workplaces. You know, the kind where people want to collaborate and they do it well. Our guest today is somebody I've looked up to for so long, the awesome Kim Malone Scott. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you so much. I admire your work and I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, thank you so much. Kim, everyone, in case you don't know about her, is a best-selling author. She is an expert on this topic that we're going to be talking about today. And a big welcome to our community. Please send us your questions for Kim as it relates to creating more inclusive, respectful workplaces, or about her book, Just Work. We're excited to learn from Kim today, right along with you. So, Kim, I want to fluff your feathers for a minute and tell people a little bit about you and some of the great work you've done. So, Kim is the author of Just Work, Get Shit Done Fast and Fair, and the book Radical Candor. She's co-founder of the company Radical Candor, and she was a CEO coach at Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and more. Wow. She's also faculty at Apple University, and before that, she led AdSense, YouTube, and DoubleClick. She lives with her family in Silicon Valley. Great place to have your HQ, Kim. So I want to dive right in here and ask, why was this book, Just Work, a must-write for you?
Well, I decided to write it shortly after I published Radical Candor. If you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of feedback. And indeed, I did. And some of the most meaningful feedback I got came right after I gave a Radical Candor presentation at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, somebody I really respected and liked enormously, and also one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And she pulled me aside after I gave the presentation and she said, you know what, Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want, but I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to put it into practice than it is for you. And she explained to me that as soon as she offered even the most compassionate criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And when she said that to me, I had three revelations at the same time. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I wanted to be. I had failed to be an upstander for her. I had not even noticed the extent to which she always had to show up at every single meeting we were ever in together, unfailingly pleasant. And believe me, in that period of time, she had, as we all do, what to be annoyed about. And so that was revelation number one. Revelation number two was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a woman in the workplace. Not only was it harder for her to put radical candor into practice than it was for me, it was harder for me to put it into practice than it was for the men who I worked with. And I hadn't really addressed that in the book. So that was number two. And the number three was that I had failed to be the kind of leader that I imagined myself to be. I thought because I had started several companies, I had built these big teams at Google, and I imagined that I was creating this wonderful, inclusive work environment. And I realized that I had failed to do so. So those were the reasons why I really had to write Just Work.
Well, and it's such a beautiful, natural extension of your radical candor work. I absolutely love it. And it feels like the perfect next step, in the messages you share. I do want to let you know, Kim, we're getting a notice from LinkedIn that we're having trouble streaming to LinkedIn. So while we're streaming to YouTube and Facebook, we'll need to share this after the fact. So I just want to let you know that. But we can still share it broadly.
Excellent.
One of the things you make a point about, Kim, in your book that I really appreciate is that we can't change what we don't see.
Yeah.
You can't speak up about something if you don't have that recognition ability. And so I'm curious, how can we notice better? How can we be better noticers if there is exclusionary or harmful behavior happening around us?
Yeah, and especially if we're the person who's causing harm. Like when I wrote the book, I really struggled with thinking of myself as a victim, but even less did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And so how can we learn to notice? So one of the things that I did was to actually hire someone who a new job description, my bias buster. Mm-hmm. And this was Breeze, actually a number of people, but one of the people I worked most closely with was Breeze Harper. And she pointed out to me a number of ways in which my use of language excluded people. And in fact, I'll share with you one word that she pointed out to me, which was the word see. That's why because I wrote that in the first draft of the book. I said, we can't fix problems we refuse to see. And then I changed it to notice because she pointed out that see was ableist. And it was so important for me to change that because I wanted words matter and I wanted to use the right words. I'm a writer like you. And also because another one of the people who is helping me write the book is super clear thinker, a guy named Zach Shore, who's a historian who's blind. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I care about Zach, the last thing I wanted to do is use words that would harm him or other blind people. So I really thought that that the bias busting had worked. But then another thing that I talked about is the importance of quantifying your bias. And so before I sent the book into my editor, I thought, well, why don't I do control find and make sure I haven't used the word see incorrectly. It's a 350-page book. Guess how many times I had used sloppy site metaphors?
Ooh, 20?
99 times.
Wow.
And this was so I think the important thing here is hire people if you can afford to do it. Hire people who will, and if you can't, just ask people to bust your bias, but then you have to be persistent about it, because changing these patterns of thought and changing these patterns of language is difficult. So you have to be patient with yourself, but also really persistent.
That's such an important thing and requires lowering the defenses a little bit. Yeah. Almost expecting you're going to get that feedback, not if, right? But when.
Yeah, you got to solicit it. It goes back to soliciting feedback. But it's very different. Radical candor was about saying too much or things like this hits much harder. When I get feedback that I've said something that's biased, it's hard not to feel ashamed. And so it's really important for me to learn how to manage my own and recognize my own shame feelings of shame, because when I feel ashamed, I get defensive. And so one of the other things I learned to do is to recognize where do I feel shame in my body? It's actually a physical response. When we feel ashamed, we have a flight or fight or fawn response. And none of those are engaging the parts of our minds that are going to lead us to the best place. And so I learned to recognize that when I feel ashamed, I get a tingling in the back of my knees. It's almost like the same sensation of walking too close to the edge of a precipice. And so I would encourage people to learn how to recognize shame in themselves so that they can back away from it and manage their own defensive response.
That's great. And not just shame spiral. Which, right, is easy
natural.
to do. Yeah. I love that, though. But that you can actually be more effective if you allow yourself to move on from it, and give yourself some permission. One of the things you're known for is being so great at naming things and reminding people about terminology and, the importance of clearly, identifying what it is you're noticing or talking about. You differentiate things like bias, prejudice, and bullying, which can sometimes get conflated, in people's minds. Can you talk to us a little bit about bias and how we should be thinking about it uniquely?
Sure. So to me, the way to differentiate between bias, prejudice, and bullying is to simplify the definitions. There's so much written about each of these topics. But if you think about bias as not meaning it, it's usually an unconscious thought pattern that is emerging, but you don't really mean the implications of what it is that you're saying. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's a very conscious belief. And bullying is being mean or meaning harm. And these are three very different sort of attitudes and behaviors, and each of them demand a different response if we're going to be effective in eliminating these attitudes and behaviors. So that was sort of really trying to tease that apart, was at least for me the exciting part of writing this book, and really has helped me respond in the moment to figure out what to say when I don't know what to say. Because none of us do in these moments, when either we observe these things happening, or when they're coming at us, or when we're the leader.
Right. And, it's making me realize, what do you think about it when you don't know the difference? For example, somebody says something that feels like a slight to you, and you're not sure if it's bias where it's unintended, or maybe it was meant to diminish you. Is there anything in a situation like that you might recommend doing to get a little deeper or understand it better?
Sure. So if you think about how to respond to each differently, if it's bias, if I think it's, and by the way, you don't have to be sure, but if you think it's bias, so give yourselves a big part of this book is about, let's cut ourselves some slack. You don't have to be exactly sure, but if it feels off to you and you think it's probably bias, use an I statement. An I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. So I don't think you're going to treat me seriously when you refer to me as honey. For example, I hate it when people call me honey. So that is an I statement. Whereas if you suspect it's prejudice, you want an it statement. So, for example, Trier Bryant, who I co-founded a company called Just Work with Trier Bryant. She was in a hiring meeting, and they had interviewed a bunch of candidates, and by far and away, the most qualified candidate, according to the interviewers, was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interviews. But the hiring manager said, we can't move to offer with this candidate, because we can't put someone with that hair in front of the business. It's remarkable that someone would say this, but they did, and at a very well-known company. And so what's an it statement that you can use in that? Because this is a conscious belief. She's like, this is not unconscious bias. Right. And I think it's really like, I always was, part of the reason I was in denial is I want to always believe it's unconscious bias, but sometimes it's actually, sometimes people believe that stuff they're saying. But You can't imagine. So an it statement can appeal to the law, or it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So it is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it is in the state of California, at least. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. Nowhere in the job description did it talk about hair. And so, so that's that. And it's so much more difficult to confront prejudice than it is bias. But sometimes the person's behavior, there's no belief, they're just being mean, right? And that's bullying. And so for example, I had started this software company, and I had an employee who was not doing a very good job on his project. And I said to him, I was giving him some feedback, and I said to him, what could I do or stop doing to help you get this project back on track? And he kind of looks at me and he says, you know what the problem here is? The problem here is you are the most aggressive woman I ever met. And I'm like, whoa, you know? Yeah, we are in an aggressive industry, and and part of your job is dealing with aggressive people. And if I'm the most aggressive woman you ever met, I'm probably not even on a list of the top 100 most aggressive men you ever met. So your problem is not my aggression. Your problem is my gender. And in my case, that's not going to change. So that's not what I said to him, but that's what I wish I had said.
Right, for sure. Of course, all of us have that.
Yeah, I did not have the presence of mind to say that to him. But what I could have said is, you can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here? Or I could have said all that stuff I just said. But it's a you statement, because with bullying, like with bias, you want to invite the person in. You want to pull them closer to understand things from your perspective. But with bullying, you want to push them away. You want to sort of create a small consequence for the person. My daughter actually explained this to me. She was getting bullied when she was in third grade, and which was terrible for a mom or for anybody to see. And so I was giving her some advice to kind of use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, blah, blah. And she banged her fist on the table. And she said, Mom, he is trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded? I thought, gosh, that is a really good point.
Whoa,
from the mouth of
mind exploded on that one.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that was when I turned to my husband, because men deal with bullying, probably even as children, even more than, and so he said he was the one who explained to me, you statement, you've got to push them away. You got to push that bully away.
Wow. It reminds me of business school a little bit. Yes. There's kind of a philosophy. I know it can be kind of a thigh slapping, very testosterone filled environment. And I remember that same principle applying. Kind of, if somebody roasted you, you roasted them back 1.5 times the amount. Yeah. And it was part of how it all worked. I love how you provided those kind of conversation starters that make such smart sense for each of those different scenarios. That is a gift to this field of DEI, to have that clarity.
Yeah, a simple framework with the first, and if you're not sure what to say, just decide, I'm going to start with the word I'm going to start with the word it, or I'm going to start with the word you. And then take it from there. Because it is it's so hard in the moment to know what to say. It is really difficult.
Yes. And having that single word prompt is often enough to help you go, okay, I can do this.
I can say something.
Yeah. And to an earlier point you made, this is not about perfection. Many of us probably aren't always going to find the perfect words, but you're really helping us get there and get closer to it. I wonder, when you look at leaders specifically, what you see as their role today in building more equitable workplaces.
Yeah, so let's go back and think about how can leaders, because the job of a leader is to prevent bias, prejudice, and bullying. But of course, it's impossible to prevent, but that's the fun thing about being a leader. It's an impossible job. But what can you do to respond to them when they happen so that they don't happen again? So I think in the case of bias, what I recommend is a bias disruptor. And so for example, I had a friend of mine, Aileen Lee, was going into a meeting, and she knew more. She was the expert on her team. But of course, the other side that they were trying to get the deal with, every time Aileen would speak, would ask questions of the men on her team, as though Aileen hadn't ever had that happen to you.
Oh, yes.
And so it happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time. And finally, Aileen's business partner said, I think you need to ask that question to Aileen, not to me. It's a nice statement, but that almost now, and he, it changed the whole dynamic in the room when he did that. And much easier for the upstander to do it than if Aileen had done that. Then you get bias on top of bias. All of a sudden they would have accused her of being oversensitive or something. And so what can leaders do to make it more common that kind of upstanding occurs? Because it shouldn't always be on the shoulders of underrepresented people to respond to bias. It should be everybody's job. And so a bias disruptor, there are 3 parts to it. The first part is a shared vocabulary. What are you going to say? So it can be an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. And the whole team can agree to that. Trier and I use a purple flag because it seems more.
I love that.
Yes. I went out and bought, it was Trier's idea. And that's very helpful. If she says something biased, I wave my flag. If I say something biased, she waves her flag. Or sometimes I wave the flag on myself. I realize I've done it again. And so that is very helpful. So shared vocabulary is part 1. Part number 2 is teaching people how to respond when the flag is flown on something they said. Because as we talked about before, there's always this feeling of shame. And so if you know what to say, it makes it easier to deal with those feelings of shame. So no matter whether you understand or you don't understand, you start with, thank you for pointing it out. And then if you get it, say, I get it. I'm going to work on not doing it again. And then if you don't get it, say, I don't get it. Can we talk after the meeting? And the reason why it's important to talk after the meeting is because bias should be disrupted in every meeting. It is happening in every meeting. I promise you, in every meeting, in every company, every hour, every day, it is happening. It is rearing its ugly head. And so you want to get in the habit of making these disruptions very fast so they don't disrupt the whole meeting, because if you're silent about bias, you reinforce it. So that's how to respond to it. Now, the third part is a commitment to flagging bias at least once in every meeting you have. So you notice I already did it on the word see, and I'll probably do it again at some point in this meeting. So that's, I think, creating sort of a shared vocabulary and a norm of how to respond and an expectation that it's going to get used in your meetings every time is a really important thing that leaders can do to disrupt bias, to prevent bias from harming their team's ability to collaborate and to be respectful. In terms of prejudice, you really need a code of conduct. People are free to believe whatever they want, but they are not free to impose those beliefs on others. And making that line clear for your organization sounds easy, really hard to do, but write that code of conduct. And then for bullying, it's crucial that leaders create consequences, either conversational consequences or compensation consequences or career consequences, because bullying kills a team's ability to collaborate. It's a local maximum. It's often effective for the bully and bad for everyone else. And your job as a leader is to create a collaborative work environment, and bullying will kill it. So you got to really create those consequences.
I love your prompts, especially. I think I have not heard something that encourages people that much to call out bias in action. And I haven't heard a system that makes it that safe, honestly, to do that. Where it's safe, it's expected. You will most likely be called out. You will be calling out. That's radical to me, and it's really exciting to think about embedding it. Yeah, that's right.
And I like to think of it as calling in. One of the teams that we work with used peace, and so the point is, we all have our biases, and one of the services we can offer one another is to make sure that we're educating ourselves on bias, and it is a gift to do that.
This is
For
beautiful.
one another. Yeah.
Yes. I wondered if you would emphasize anything with your whole journey of writing this book, all your incredible CEO coaching experiences, teaching at Apple, being a fierce leader in your own right. When it comes to gender inclusion, is there anything you would emphasize in particular? I know lots of people listening want to make movement and momentum in this area. What would you say?
I would say that the best thing we can do is we can end the default to silence. I know that one of the things that I wish I had done more of in my career is to speak up earlier. And I know that it can be risky to speak up. So I don't want to eliminate people's choice to be silent. It is a legitimate choice to be silent, but make it an active choice. Make it, because if you feel like you can't say anything, and then you, at least I found I wound up in this vicious cycle of silence and rage. And the more silent I was, the more likely the thing was to happen again. And then I was madder. And then because I was mad, I didn't trust myself to speak up. And that vicious cycle of silence and rage, it hurt my sense of agency, and it ultimately hurt me more than it hurt anyone else. So I think when Audre Lorde says your silence will not protect you, recognize that and do a quick ROI analysis. Is this worth fighting? And also, I think we're more aware, we're more conscious of the risks of speaking up, and we're less conscious of the risks of remaining silent. And there are real risks. So do a proactive ROI and own your response to this stuff. One of the things that makes me really optimistic is the extent to which, especially young women, are telling these stories in ways that I did not when I was younger, earlier in my career. And I think the more stories we tell, the more solidarity we build, and the more we're likely to address these things. I will say one other thing. I think gender injustice does not operate in a vacuum. It is connected to racial injustice. All of these forms of injustice are connected. So make sure you're building solidarity. I will say, as a white woman, I don't think white women have done as good a job on that as I would like to see us do.
Yeah, really bringing the intersectional lens is so important. It's so important. And I'm really struck by what you said around the risk of silence, not just calculating the risk of speaking up, but the risk of silence. I know I've been one of those people, especially junior in my career, ruminating in the slights or the things that were upsetting about myself or someone else. And it's hard to remember that, that there was no opportunity for somebody else to cure it.
Yes.
When I didn't speak up,
Yes.
And finding your voice in that way really matters. So I keep coming back to some of your points around self-compassion.
Yeah.
This isn't always going to be polished and pretty and maybe how you dream of it going with the perfect retort. That's okay.
It's okay.
That's okay.
It's okay. I think it's also okay to ask for help and to expect help from observers or upstanders. One of the reasons why I wrote Just Work was as a way to thank all of the people who helped me stand up when who did for me what Aileen's business partner did for her. It's so much easier for the upstander to say, hey, I don't think that was quite right, or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate. We can't put all the work of cleaning up the damage that workplace injustice does on the people who are harmed by workplace injustice. It's something we all need to do. And leaders can't do it alone either. There are more observers than there are of any other role. And so it's really, the role of the upstander is important. And when you ask for help, you are it's like asking for an investment. You're not going hat in hand. You're like, I am worth investing in, invest in me.
I love that. And what a ripe, opportune place for, training and organization. So people are able to say, that's not landing right with me. Can you direct your question to so-and-so, or some of those many smart retorts you've taught us? I love it. One more question for you. Our tradition is to ask for a parting truth bomb. And of course, on this important topic, I want to ask you, when it comes to getting this just work thing right, really creating just workplaces, what's a truth bomb you want us to hold on to? What should we really not forget?
So I think we've talked a lot in this conversation about differentiating between bias, prejudice, and bullying. I think it's equally important to understand that one thing leads to another, and that these are not discrete attitudes and behaviors. And that then when you layer power into the equation, things get much worse, and you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violence. And that path from bias to violence is something that makes us all uncomfortable to think about. The Anti-Defamation League has a pyramid of hate, and nobody wants to think, oh, this thing that I said actually taps into the very worst things that humanity can do. But if we fail to recognize the way that sort of systemic injustice occurs, then we don't treat bias as seriously as we should. So be aware of the connections between these attitudes and behaviors, but also differentiate among them.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful to see they're not just distinct kind of planets, right? Yeah. There are relationships and connections here. That is really powerful. Well, one of the messages I most appreciate from you, Kim, is you can do this, and you can start, and this is a learnable skill to get better at this work, no matter what your starting place. So I so appreciate your inspiration, and practical advice today has been so awesome. I hope all of you listening will go out and get Just Work. Use it with your teams, use it to spark new conversations. I'm going to add links. Yes, look at that cool cover, both to follow Kim's fabulous work, to follow her on social media channels, and to get your hands on that book, which is so important. I hope you'll stay in touch with me too. Join us on the next Women and Work Culture, and check out my LinkedIn learning courses. Thank you again, Kim. Thank you, community, and be well, everybody.
Thank you.